They started with nothing, a handful of shepherds on a muddy hill beside a river that nobody cared about. No army, no gold, no walls, just 7 hills, a bad location, and an idea that refused to die. That was 753 BC. By the time they were done, and it took them over 1,000 years to finish, they had built the largest empire the Western world had ever seen. At its peak, 1 in 4 people alive on Earth lived under Roman rule. Their roads stretched from the Scottish Highlands to the sands of the Sahara. Their language became the foundation of half the languages spoken today. Their laws still govern courtrooms in 2025. Their architecture still defines what we call civilization. But this is not a story about marble and glory. This is a story about men who murdered their brothers to build a city, about generals who crossed the Alps with war elephants in winter because nobody thought it was possible, about a Senate that stabbed its own leader 23 times on the floor of a theater and then argued about whether it was legal, about an empire so vast that it took 3 weeks just to ride from one end to the other, and still, eventually, collapsed. Rome was not built in a day, but it burned faster than anyone expected. This is the entire history of the Roman Empire, from the she-wolf and the shepherd twins to the last emperor, a boy named Romulus, who nobody remembers, sitting on a throne that no longer meant anything, in a city that had already forgotten what it once was. 1,200 years, dozens of emperors, hundreds of wars, one impossible story. Let's start at the beginning. Chapter 1, The Legend of Rome's Founding. Before there was an empire, before there was a republic, before there were even walls, there was a story. And like all the best stories, it begins with a murder. Go back to 753 BC. Central Italy. A region called Latium. Flat, marshy, unremarkable. The Tiber River winds through it slowly, brown and wide. On its eastern bank, 7 hills rise out of the floodplain. Nobody has built anything here yet. Nobody particularly wants to, but somewhere upstream, in a city called Alba Longa, a king named Numitor has just been overthrown by his own brother Amulius. It's a familiar story in the ancient world. Brother kills brother, takes the throne, eliminates the competition. Amulius does it efficiently. He kills Numitor's sons. He forces Numitor's daughter, Rhea Silvia, to become a Vestal virgin, a priestess bound by sacred law to remain celibate. No children. No heirs. No threat. It should have worked. But Rhea Silvia becomes pregnant anyway. She claims the father is Mars, the god of war himself. Whether anyone believed her is not recorded. What is recorded is that she gave birth to twin boys. Amulius ordered them drowned in the Tiber. The servant tasked with the drowning couldn't do it. Instead, he placed the twins in a basket and set them adrift on the river. The basket floated downstream. It came to rest at the foot of a hill, the Palatine Hill, one of those 7 unremarkable rises above the floodplain. And there, according to the story, a she-wolf found them. She didn't kill them. She nursed them, fed them alongside her own cubs, kept them warm, kept them alive, until a shepherd named Faustulus discovered the twins and brought them home to his wife. They named the boys Romulus and Remus. The boys grew up strong. They grew up wild. And eventually, inevitably, they found out who they really were. They marched on Alba Longa, killed Amulius, and restored their grandfather Numitor to the throne. Then they left. They went back to those 7 hills on the Tiber, the place where the wolf had saved them, and decided to build something new. A city of their own. And this is where the founding story gets darker. The brothers disagreed on which hill to build on. Romulus chose the Palatine. Remus chose the Aventine. They decided to settle it the way Romans would settle almost everything for the next 1,000 years, through a contest of will, followed by violence. They watched the skies for omens. Remus saw 6 vultures. Romulus saw 12. Romulus won. He began marking out the boundaries of his city with a plow, cutting a sacred furrow in the earth, the Pomerium, the boundary line that would separate Rome from everything outside it, sacred, inviolable, uncrossable. Remus crossed it. Whether he did it to mock his brother, to test him, or simply because he didn't believe the boundary was real, we don't know. What we know is what happened next. Romulus killed him. his own twin, the other half of the founding myth, dead before the city had a single wall. There are different versions of this story. Some say Romulus struck him down himself. Others say it was one of Romulus's followers, and Romulus simply didn't stop it. Either way, the message was the same. The boundary of Rome is absolute. Cross it, and you die, even if you are family, even if you are blood. Rome was founded on fratricide, and somehow that feels exactly right. Romulus became the first king of Rome. He needed citizens, so he did what any practical founder would do. He declared Rome an asylum city. Escaped slaves, exiles, fugitives, criminals from across Latium, all welcome. Rome would take anyone, judge no one, ask no questions. It worked. Men flooded in, but they were almost entirely men. Rome had a population and no women, which meant Rome had no future. So Romulus invited the neighboring Sabine tribe to a festival. Games, feasting, entertainment. The Sabines came, men, women, children. And at a signal, the Romans seized the Sabine women and drove the Sabine men away. The rape of the Sabine women. Not a footnote. The foundational act of Roman demographic policy. The Sabine men came back to fight, of course. There was a war. But by the time the armies faced each other, the Sabine women, now Roman wives, now Roman mothers, ran between the two sides and refused to let them fight. They had fathers on one side and husbands on the other. They chose neither. They chose peace. The two peoples merged. Rome absorbed the Sabines. It was the first of many absorptions. This was the Roman method, established from the very beginning. Take what you need, incorporate what you take, make it Roman, move on. Romulus ruled for 37 years. Then, one day, during a review of his troops on the Campus Martius, a storm came up suddenly. And when it cleared, Romulus was gone. Vanished. No body, no explanation. The official story was that Mars had taken him back, that he had ascended to become a god, the divine Quirinus, protector of Rome. The unofficial story, whispered by historians even in antiquity, was that the senators had grown tired of his increasingly autocratic rule and had torn him apart with their own hands, each man hiding a piece of the body under his toga. Rome's first king, possibly murdered by his own senate. Again, it feels exactly right. Chapter 2. The Kingdom of Rome. Romulus was gone, and Rome, barely a generation old, already faced its first existential question. What happens now? In most ancient societies, the answer was simple. A king dies, his son takes the throne. Power passes through blood. But Rome had no clear heir, and the city was still young enough, and strange enough, to try something different. The Senate chose the next king. His name was Numa Pompilius, and where Romulus had been a warrior, Numa was something Rome had never really had before. A man of peace. He built temples. He established the priestly colleges, the religious calendar, the rituals that would govern Roman public life for centuries. He created the office of the Vestal Virgins, the sacred priestesses who tended the eternal flame of Rome. The fire that, according to Roman belief, could never be allowed to go out as long as Rome itself endured. Numa reigned for 43 years. Rome didn't fight a single war. It was, depending on your perspective, either a golden age or an enormous waste of time. The Romans themselves were never entirely sure which. After Numa came Tullus Hostilius, a king so different from his predecessor that the contrast felt almost deliberate. Where Numa had built Rome's soul, Tullus wanted to build its muscles. He was aggressive, militaristic, contemptuous of religion and ritual. He picked fights with Alba Longa, the very city that Romulus and Remus had come from, and eventually destroyed it entirely, forcing its entire population to relocate to Rome. Rome grew. Rome always grew. Tullus was followed by Ancus Marcius, Numa's grandson, who managed to combine both traditions, pious enough to satisfy the priests, aggressive enough to satisfy the generals. He extended Roman territory to the coast, founding the port city of Ostia at the mouth of the Tiber. For the first time, Rome had access to the sea. Then came the Tarquins. Lucius Tarquinius Priscus was not Roman by birth. He was Etruscan, from the powerful civilization to the north that had long dominated central Italy. He came to Rome as an outsider, talked his way into the confidence of King Ancus, and when Ancus died, smoothly maneuvered himself onto the throne before Ancus's own sons could claim it. The Romans didn't seem to mind. Tarquin was capable, ambitious, and effective. He drained the marshy lowlands between the hills, creating the Forum, the flat central space that would become the beating heart of Roman public life for 1,000 years. He built the Circus Maximus, where Romans would eventually watch chariot races with 100,000 of their closest friends. He began construction on a temple to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill, the most important temple in Rome, the symbolic center of Roman religion. He also started a war with the Sabines, which he won, and with the Latins, which he also won. He was, by any measure, one of the most consequential kings Rome ever had. He was assassinated by the sons of Ancus Marcius, the ones who had been passed over for the throne a generation earlier. They had long memories, the Romans. His wife Tanaquil, formidable, politically brilliant, and not willing to let everything her husband built collapse, acted quickly. She concealed the king's death long enough to secure the succession of her son-in-law, Servius Tullius. By the time the city knew Tarquin was dead, the new king was already in place. Servius Tullius turned out to be remarkable in his own right. He reorganized Roman society from the ground up, creating the census, dividing the population into classes based on wealth, and restructuring the army accordingly. For the first time, Rome had a systematic way of counting itself, taxing itself, and fielding a professional military force. These were not small innovations. The Roman census would run, more or less continuously, for the next 700 years. He also built the Servian Wall, the great defensive circuit that enclosed all 7 hills of Rome for the first time, turning a collection of hilltop settlements into something that genuinely looked like a city. And then his daughter had him murdered. Tullia, ambitious, ruthless, and married to the last of the Tarquin line, conspired with her husband, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, to overthrow her own father. Superbus had Servius thrown down the steps of the Senate house. Servius, old and wounded, tried to make it home. Tullia drove her carriage over his body in the street. The Romans remembered that street for centuries. They called it the Street of Crime. Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, became the 7th and final king of Rome. He was everything the name suggested: arrogant, tyrannical. He ruled by fear, executed senators without trial, and treated the Roman people as subjects rather than citizens. He was also, despite everything, effective. He completed the Temple of Jupiter on the Capitoline. He extended Roman influence across Latium through a combination of war and diplomacy. He made Rome, by the standards of the ancient world, genuinely powerful, but power without legitimacy has a shelf life. The end came in 509 BC, and it came because of his son. Sextus Tarquinius raped Lucretia, a noble woman of impeccable reputation, wife of a Roman officer, daughter of a Roman prefect. Lucretia told her father and her husband what had happened, made them swear an oath of revenge, and then killed herself. She would not, she said, allow a dishonored woman to serve as a precedent for unchaste Roman wives. Her kinsman Lucius Junius Brutus, a man who had spent years pretending to be a fool to survive at the Tarquin court, took her body to the Forum and displayed it before the Roman people. He gave a speech. He named what had been done. He called for the expulsion of the Tarquins. The people responded. Tarquinius Superbus was driven out of Rome. He tried to come back, twice, with armies provided by neighboring peoples who thought they could use him. Both times he failed. He died in exile in a Greek colony in southern Italy, old and bitter, the last king Rome would ever have. Because Rome had decided something in that moment of collective fury over Lucretia's body, something that would define it for the next 5 centuries. No more kings. Never again. The word rex king became the most toxic word in the Roman political vocabulary. Men would be killed merely for seeming to want it. The Romans didn't just overthrow their monarchy. They built their entire political identity around the rejection of it. What they built instead would be messier, noisier, more chaotic, and in many ways more brilliant than anything a king could have managed. They called it the Republic. Chapter 3: The Roman Republic. The Romans solved the problem of kings the way engineers solve a structural flaw. They didn't just remove the dangerous part, they redesigned the entire system around making sure it could never happen again. No single man would hold power. Instead, two men would share it, elected annually, each with the ability to veto the other. They called them consuls, and the system was so deliberately awkward, so intentionally inefficient, that concentrating too much power in a single pair of hands became almost structurally impossible. Almost. The first two consuls were Lucius Junius Brutus, the man who had driven out the Tarquins, and Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, the husband of Lucretia. It was a symbolic pairing, the avenger and the widower, the revolution and its cause governing together. It lasted about 5 minutes. Collatinus had the wrong name. The Romans had just expelled an entire dynasty called Tarquinius. And however innocent the new consul was, his name was a daily reminder of everything they had thrown out. He was pressured to resign and go into exile. He went. Brutus replaced him with another man and got on with the business of running a republic. That business turned out to be considerably more complicated than running a kingdom. The republic rested on a web of institutions, traditions, and unwritten rules that the Romans called the mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors. It wasn't a constitution in the modern sense. There was no single document. It was more like an accumulated understanding of how things were done, enforced not by law, but by social pressure, reputation, and the collective memory of the Senate. The Senate itself was not technically a legislative body. It couldn't pass laws. What it could do was issue decrees, control the treasury, assign military commands, manage foreign policy, and make life extremely difficult for anyone who ignored it. In practice, the Senate ran Rome. Its members were drawn from the aristocratic families, the patricians, who had been accumulating land, wealth, and influence since the founding. Below the patricians were the plebeians, the common people, farmers, craftsmen, merchants, soldiers. They made up the vast majority of Rome's population and had, at the beginning of the Republic, almost no formal political power whatsoever. They couldn't hold office. They couldn't marry patricians. They couldn't even know what the laws were, because the laws weren't written down. They existed in the heads of patrician priests who interpreted them however they liked. This arrangement did not last. What followed was one of the defining conflicts of the early Republic. A slow, grinding, centuries-long struggle between patricians and plebeians that the Romans called the conflict of the orders. It was a class war fought almost entirely through institutional means, which made it distinctly Roman. Very little blood, enormous amounts of political maneuvering. The plebeians' greatest weapon was the one that workers have always had. They could stop. In 494 BC, the plebeians simply left. They walked out of Rome en masse and settled on a hill outside the city, the Sacred Mount, and refused to come back. No farmers meant no food. No craftsmen meant no tools. No soldiers meant no army. Rome needed its plebeians far more than it liked to admit. The patricians negotiated. The plebeians got their own officers, the tribunes of the plebs, men whose persons were declared sacrosanct, inviolable, untouchable. Any magistrate who harmed a tribune could be killed by any Roman citizen without legal consequence. It was an extraordinary privilege, and it gave the plebeians something they had never had before: protection. The tribunes got something else too: the power of the veto. A tribune could stand up in any public space and shout a single Latin word: veto, I forbid, and stop any action by any magistrate in its tracks. One man, properly positioned, could paralyze the entire machinery of Roman government. This was either brilliant or insane, depending on the circumstances. Over the next 4 centuries, it would be both. The written laws came next. In 450 BC, after years of plebeian agitation, Rome produced the 12 Tables, the first written legal code in Roman history, inscribed on bronze and displayed in the Forum so that anyone could read them. The patricians had lost their monopoly on legal interpretation. The law now belonged, at least theoretically, to everyone. Slowly, over generations, the other barriers fell. Plebeians gained the right to marry patricians. Plebeians gained access to the priesthoods. And eventually, inevitably, plebeians gained the consulship itself. the highest office in the Republic. By the middle of the 4th century BC, it was legally required that at least one of the two annual consuls be a plebeian. Rome had not become a democracy. Power still flowed overwhelmingly toward the wealthy, the well-connected, and the well-born. But it had become something more flexible, more adaptive, and more durable than a rigid aristocracy. The Romans had figured out how to absorb discontent without exploding. How to give people just enough to keep them invested in the system. It was a skill they would use, and occasionally misuse, for centuries. While all of this internal negotiation was happening, Rome was also fighting. Constantly, almost without pause. The early Republic was surrounded by enemies, the Etruscans to the north, the Samnites to the south, the various Latin tribes in every direction. War was not an occasional crisis for Rome, it was the baseline condition. Roman men expected to serve in the military. Roman culture glorified military virtue above almost everything else. The Latin word for courage, virtus, was derived from vir, the word for man. To be a man was to be capable of fighting. To be a great man was to fight well. The Roman army of the early Republic was built around the phalanx, the tight formation of spear-carrying infantry borrowed from the Greeks. It worked on flat ground. It was catastrophic in broken terrain. Rome learned this the hard way, in the hills of Samnium, where 3 separate wars against the fierce Samnite tribes stretched across most of the 4th century BC and forced the Romans to completely rethink how they fought. What emerged was the legion, one of the most adaptable and lethal military formations in human history. Instead of one rigid block, the legion was divided into smaller units called maniples, each capable of operating semi-independently, adjusting to terrain, responding to flanking threats, fighting in the hills and forests that had broken the old phalanx. The soldiers were equipped with the pilum, a heavy javelin designed to bend on impact so it couldn't be thrown back, and the gladius, a short stabbing sword ideal for close-quarters fighting. The Romans drilled constantly. They built camps every time they stopped moving, even for a single night, standardized, fortified, laid out the same way every time so that any soldier from any legion could navigate it in the dark. They turned war into a system, and then they optimized the system relentlessly. By 270 BC, after 3 Samnite wars, a war against the Etruscans, and a series of brutal conflicts with Greek colonies in southern Italy, including battles against the Greek king Pyrrhus of Epirus, who won every engagement and still nearly destroyed his own army doing it. Rome controlled the entire Italian peninsula south of the Po Valley. It had taken 200 years. It had cost an incalculable number of lives. And it had transformed Rome from a city-state into something that didn't quite have a name yet. A power so large and so organized that the rest of the Mediterranean world was beginning to take notice, including Carthage. And that was going to be a problem. That's part 1 of my 4-part series on the history of the Roman Empire. Part 2 is coming soon. And trust me, things are about to get a lot bigger. So if you don't want to miss it, make sure to like and subscribe. See you then.